Well, good afternoon and welcome to our first Friday presentation. My name's Mike Kivinen. I'm a counselor at the Grand Rapids, Michigan Rehabilitation Services office. In a previous incarnation, I was a therapist for about 20 years working in addiction treatment, and I had a certification in hypnotherapy and trauma therapy.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Wolf. I'm also a voc rehab counselor here in the Grand Rapids office. Social worker by trade, and have previously worked at local centers for independent living and have had a lot of experience both personally and professionally with disabilities.
And our contact information is in the last slide. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Our colleague Emily will be monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to reserve time for questions at the end. But if for some reason we're not able to get to the questions today, then please email us and we'll certainly respond to you. Our title is "My Anxiety is Not My Identity, Confronting Self-Imposed Barriers." Not long ago, I heard an ad on the radio. It was an ad for a healthcare system, and something that really caught my ear, and it was the announcer said, "My diagnosis doesn't define me." And that saying is very much in the spirit of what we're hoping to convey here today. And we're one of our sources for the presentation is an essay by therapist and social worker Lisa Marciano, who said that emphasizing a diagnosis such as anxiety as an important part of one's identity risks fostering a sense of helplessness, which can in turn increase one's anxiety. So our outline for today is to discuss a concerning trend that we've noticed of at least what seems to be an uptick in applicants and customers who identify very strongly with an anxiety disorder diagnosis to a point of making it part of their conceptual identity at the expense of recognizing the treatability and even curability of anxiety. We're going to discuss what we believe are some contemporary cultural contributors to this trend, and we'll ask the question of whether some contemporary therapists may actually be contributing to the trend and making things worse, without, of course, meaning to. We'll revisit the importance of promoting resilience and self-efficacy, and time permitting, talk a bit more about that Lisa Marciano essay, and then we'll do our best to outline some suggested solutions, some ways that vocational rehabilitation counselors may be able to be helpful in this process.
So, when Mike and I kind of talked about having this first Friday's presentation, for me, what I really wanted to tackle was, as a VR counselor, what are common self-imposed barriers that I'm seeing come into my office every day with my customers? And some of the themes that I was noticing were all kind of related to a person's anxiety, whether or not that was an official diagnosis they had or something that they kind of spoke to. Some of the major themes that I was seeing, at least with my customers, were, they would only consider working from home. They didn't have a driver's license because they felt, too anxious to drive and therefore had to rely on others for that transportation. And a lot of the time when we would push or get into our counseling sessions and talk more about priorities and interests and barriers and capabilities, I was meeting a lot of ideas about the anxiety being an immutable aspect of that person, that it's nothing they could change, nothing they could, get at. It was something that they wanted me as the counselor just to accept and kind of move on from. And with these three common kind of barriers that I was seeing with customers, I wondered much more about kind of a larger cultural moment, what was happening in the culture, what was happening in therapy offices, and what were ways that I, as a VR counselor engaging with my clients, could kind of help them see resilience rather than having these barriers become identity points.
You came up with some questions
I
that
did. So what I was recommending, so I would recommend that clients kind of ask themselves these questions, or as a VR counselor, you would guide your customer through these questions. What does anxiety mean for my self-understanding or for my sense of identity? What resources are available that could help me reduce or even eliminate my anxiety? And how do I use my anxiety? What purpose does it serve? And, what needs am I trying to meet with the anxiety that I have?
And that might sound strange at first to hear that someone might be using symptoms to meet needs, but a number of theorists and therapists have recognized that possibility and view symptomatic behavior, including anxiety, as a misdirected attempt to meet needs. In other words, for therapists such as Michael Maniaci or William Glasser, who the reality therapy guy, what causes symptoms may be less important than what purpose the symptoms serve and what needs they meet. And some examples of those needs are survival, acceptance or belonging, power and achievement or control, fun and enjoyment, and freedom and independence. And the idea here is that these are normal, natural human needs, and that a therapist or counselor's task is to not only help customers or clients at least weigh, consider, and explore that question of, does symptomatic behavior ever function as an attempt to meet any of these needs? And if so, let's affirm the need, but let's work on finding healthier, more functional ways to meet the need.
So something that, as VR counselors, we're thinking, as we're counseling our customers through their anxieties or through any kind of other maybe self-imposed barriers they have, questions that I thought we as professionals can consider would be, how do we discuss these concerns constructively without merely creating the appearance of victim blaming our customers? So, wanting to meet them where they're at and not, blame them, but also give them some, firm realities of how they can come at the thought of anxiety differently. How do we determine when anxiety must be accommodated and when it is better to confront it or to treat it completely? And then what is the line between accommodating anxiety, the anxiety that won't change or will require extensive time and support to change, and merely enabling dysfunction at the expense of helping someone realize their resilience and self-efficacy?
So in that sense, what we're doing here today is extending material on self-efficacy and resilience that we introduced at our previous First Friday presentation last September. If you order before midnight tonight, we can send you the DVD of that. And I think there's a bonus bloopers reel too, but that was a joke. But anyway, so what are self-efficacy and resilience? Well, first of all, they've both been identified as two universal predictors of active coping during stress. And here's the good news: if you don't feel that you have them, both are teachable. It's possible to learn both. So resilience simply refers to that ability to bounce back from crises, to bounce back when things go wrong, to weather tough times and tough situations. And self-efficacy, somewhat similar to confidence, refers to the conviction that you're able to do the behaviors that you need to do to get the outcomes that you want. Now, self-efficacy beliefs don't necessarily automatically mean that one actually possesses those beliefs, but the idea here is that absent self-efficacy beliefs, folks aren't even going to try to accomplish their goals. So the guy who came up with this term, self-efficacy, thought that our sense of self-efficacy, our confidence in our ability to do what we need to do to get the results we want, plays a pivotal role in motivating our behavior. And he also thought that a common feature of all effective therapies, no matter what we call the therapy, whether we call it cognitive therapy, psychoanalysis, or behavior therapy, is that if the therapy is working, it's increasing the level and strength of the client's self-efficacy. In other words, if my therapy is working, I'm going to come out of that therapy feeling more capable and more competent than I felt going into it, at least in some area of my life. And there are several sources of self-efficacy expectations, one being actual experiences of success. Another is vicarious experience, which is a fancy $10 way of simply saying, seeing other people do things and recognizing, hey, if they can do it, maybe I can too. Verbal persuasion or encouragement from others. Learning to obtain voluntary control of one's emotional and physiological states. This could be with things like relaxation training, for example, such as practicing deep breathing before going on a webinar to quell one's mounting anxiety prior to the presentation. And finally, imaginal experiences, which is another way of saying doing things like visualization, using your imagination to imagine successfully performing the tasks you want to perform, rather than imagining everything that could go wrong. So those are some of the sources of self-efficacy expectations.
So when we first brought up this topic, I mentioned that there were concerns that I had, at least, and Mike we agreed to these concerns as we were researching this, that there's this cultural moment that in a cultural movement that could be kind of working against the idea of resilience. And part of that is tied into the idea that any kind of anxiety is seen as really negative in our society and our culture, and that we need to create safe spaces and create places where people are going to be protected because of their anxiety. At the same time, we are dealing with 24-hour news cycles constantly barraging us with crises and violence and very real terrors that are happening. And so there seems to be this disconnect of the ability for a person to understand how to handle anxiety healthily. I think there's also an apparent contradiction between this emerging idea of identity first when it comes to, in particular, the disability population. So if we want to utilize anxiety as a disability, and the concept of person first language that we've historically seen in legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So identity first language is an expression of who I am. So I'll use myself as an example. I am legally blind and I have cerebral palsy. Right there, by making those statements, I've stated that I've stated person first language. I'm Cassandra, I have these disabilities. But if I were to utilize identity first language, I might say something like, I'm blind. And that, constitutes as that's an immutable part of my identity. So therefore, by that logic, any kind of treatment or movement towards rehabilitating my vision loss could be seen as really, impacting or negatively impacting how I see myself.
Right, it's like by that logic, if you view your disability, your anxiety, or your cerebral palsy as who you are, then in a sense, especially if you're identifying it as a expression of cultural diversity, as Newman refers to it, then by that logic, there's also an investment in not treating it or remediating it to the extent that it could be treated or remediated, because it has now become who I am.
Mhm.
Along those, a related concern that came up was, I recalled an essay from several years ago by a medical educator that really made an impact on me. The column he wrote, Howard Brody wrote, was called Either Or Disease, a Serious Infection of the Attitude. And we don't have time to go into too much detail on this essay, but I thought it was very impactful. He made the point that when we get into extreme either or thinking, particularly with medical, psychiatric, and behavioral issues, that it often occurs to our detriment and to the detriment of people that we want to help. And he said that he thought that whenever the topic is human behavior, both the general public and many physicians fall into this trap that he called either or disease. And that's the tendency to view problems such as, well, one of the examples he used specifically was addiction, to view addiction and certain other mental health concerns such as anxiety as either entirely biological and genetic, or entirely behavioral and a choice. And instead of thinking in those kind of simplistic and polarizing terms, he advocated more of a both and approach. And as we discussed this, we thought that perhaps either or disease is infecting the current cultural moment and how we conceptualize and discuss many issues involving mental health, disability, and so forth.
So something that really stood out to me when thinking about either or, as I think about how I've navigated, working in the field of disability and having disabilities myself, the medical model and the individual model of disability is kind of the historical model. It's what we've used to say that kind of all of the concerns, the problems with the disability is within the person themselves and the diagnosis. So that's how we need to treat it and fix it and rehabilitate it. And then the social model came along about 50 years ago to state that really the problem isn't me or my disabilities. The problem is the culture, and the problem is the society that's not built to accommodate me and my disabilities. And truthfully, I think the healthiest approach that we as counselors, and I think that we can help our clients take, is to say, we don't have to have it either way. It doesn't either or, there can be good modes of treatment from both models of disability, and to say it's both, what can we take from either model to help the person sitting in front of us to build their resilience and self-efficacy.
And either model taken to an extreme really not only leaves something out, but could be harmful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another couple other contributors to what we're calling this cultural moment. One is something called concept creep. And what that refers to is the broadening and over application of constructs such as trauma, safety, bullying, violence. You'll hear people sometimes now say things like language is violence, for example. Well, certainly people can be mean, nasty, and abusive with things that they say, but to reframe language in those terms would certainly also be an example of this concept creep. And Haslam noted that, of course, concepts do change over time, and sometimes conceptual changes are well motivated, but concept creep runs the risk of turning everyday experiences into a kind of sickness or pathology, and can also encourage a heightened sensitivity to a subjective sense of victimhood.
I think an extreme example of this is definitely in certain circles of disability studies, there is this idea that if you view one's, if your disability is your identity, then any kind of attempts to remediate that or to fix it is actually, the viewpoint goes, you're trying to eliminate people with disabilities. And while not everyone in this academic field feels that way, that is certainly a prominent view. And I think it's one that is dangerous, that we need to be aware of, to say, how is the cultural moment impacting the customer sitting in front of us?
Along with this sense of inadvertently or otherwise promoting a sense of victimhood and victimization, another potential contributor we identified is the contemporary emphasis on microaggressions. This is less extreme than what Cassandra just mentioned, but it's certainly more pervasive right now. And we've all heard that term, and please know that there are a number of critics of that term, a number of fairly prominent critics of that term, and or that construct rather, and the critics of the microaggression construct characterize it as really being a kind of cognitive therapy in reverse that fosters and reinforces the very habits of mind, the very ways of thinking and emoting that anyone practicing cognitive therapy is actually trying to help people overcome. And so we'll briefly discuss both cognitive behavioral therapy and microaggressions. A couple of the critics of the microaggressions concept say that they've identified a couple of what they call untruths that they believe are contributing to decreased resilience among young people. One of those is a belief that people are fragile. Another is a belief in emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is actually a category of what cognitive therapists call cognitive distortions, meaning systematic errors in reasoning that contribute to emotional distress. Emotional reasoning means if I feel something is true, then it's true. So again, the central thesis of at least a couple of the authors that we're considering here is that what we've just mentioned produces a psychological approach to the world that functions as cognitive therapy in reverse. So let's talk about cognitive therapy for a moment and then come back to this. So the basic idea of cognitive therapy, and I'm not saying cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT as it's sometimes called, I'm not saying that's the one and only true, but it's certainly a very popular and well-researched form of therapy. And the basic idea of it is that how you think affects what you do and how you feel. And so part of the approach is learning to help people observe and think critically about their own thinking, to weigh and consider whether their thoughts accurately reflect reality. Because you can learn, according to this model, to recognize and replace the kinds of thoughts that cause your emotional upsets. And those are the cognitive distortions I just mentioned. So some categories of cognitive distortion then are emotional reasoning, which we just mentioned, mind reading, not in the sense of genuinely having telepathy, but in the sense of thinking you know what other people are thinking or what they what's motivating them, and then reacting emotionally to that. And then catastrophizing, going from zero to worst case scenario immediately based on limited information. So again, the main purpose of CBT is to train people not to think catastrophically and to promote a more resilient approach to the world. And a couple of the authors that we looked at in preparing this presentation are of the opinion that this reverse CBT is in fact exemplified by a heightened sensitivity to microaggressions, and that to continue promoting that concept potentially makes participants less mentally and emotionally healthy than they were before. Now, that concept, microaggressions, that we've all heard, isn't exactly new. It's actually was coined about 50-something years ago, back in 1970, but it didn't really become popularized until 2007. And if you read descriptions of the concept, it includes unintentional slights and is defined entirely in terms of the recipient's subjective interpretation. Again, that's the cognitive distortion of emotional reasoning. In no way are we saying that people aren't sometimes rude, abrasive, obnoxious, and passive aggressive. At the same time, we are expressing concern that too much emphasis on this concept amounts to emotional reasoning. And ironically, the authors were considering here point out that by the logic of the microaggression concept, cognitive therapy itself could be construed as a microaggression because it requires questioning clients' or patients' premises and assumptions, the kinds of thought processes that are causing their feelings. And it requires helping them examine and challenge their interpretive framework. So just like over-identifying with a diagnosis, we believe that heightened sensitivity to perceived microaggressions risks fostering that victim mentality that we mentioned earlier at the expense of truly empowering clients and promoting resilience and self-efficacy.
So, I think something that COVID-19 has kind of had with the pandemic, there's been a lot of conversations about, mental health and anxiety. But even before that happened, there were a lot of studies and reports written about the rising of teen anxiety. And so, some of these researchers thought that perhaps this was the prevalence of teen anxiety in particular was due to Generation Z being able to talk more openly about mental health concerns and speak about anxiety. And that can be a positive thing, but there also can be, concerns about how that conversation can be used negatively for these individuals as well.
Yeah, there's concern that some other factors may be contributing as well, including the concept creep we just mentioned, a certain contagion effect that can happen, or it's called a looping effect. When social scientists describe a cultural phenomenon, and in so doing have the effect of fostering or promoting more of that phenomenon. There's also something that, time permitting, we'll come back to, that's been identified again as a sort of culture of victimhood. And therapists prematurely affirming clients' self-identification. I think when we were discussing this, we raised the question, well, what if my self-identification is my self-imposed barrier? I'm anxious and therefore I cannot X, Y, and Z.
I'm anxious and therefore I cannot work.
Yes. I reminded here of the Sufi teacher, Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, who said that one of the ways that we limit ourselves most is by creating a particular notion of ourselves that's our prison.
So I think a question that comes to mind is, when do you accommodate and when do you confront or treat anxiety? So I think that aspects of our current cultural moment make it more difficult to determine when it should be accommodated and when it's better to challenge it or even treat it. I think so,
Yeah,
Patsy, yeah.
and well, and along with that, many therapists are now practicing under the influence of critical social justice and the various other critical theories. And so some commentators have raised the question of whether this is inadvertently causing mental health therapists themselves to foster the very kind of concerns we're discussing today. Because it seems as if these therapists may be emphasizing collective and systemic contributors to mental health symptoms, such as race, gender, identity, and so forth, at the expense of adequately helping their customers or clients explore internal contributors. Again, let's not succumb to either or disease, but there has been an expression of concern that these therapists may be prematurely validating clients' feelings and perceptions at the expense of encouraging them to examine, explore, and begin to challenge their assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So one, clinician puts it this way. So anxiety, we know that anxiety thrives in avoidance. And one clinician says, although enabling a child to avoid his fears can make him feel better, this is often temporary respite. In fact, accommodating a child's anxiety maintains and reinforces fear in the long term. Indeed, children in these situations often develop the belief that they are unable to cope with anxiety or that the fear itself is actually threatening. And that's something that I think persists even in adulthood if we continue to encourage the avoidance of dealing with our own anxieties. So something as a counselor, something that I've always tried to kind of hold after I've heard it was a quote from Jordan Peterson. And he essentially says, it's not our job as counselors or therapists to affirm or have foregone conclusions about our clients' identities. Rather, our job is to help them sort out when things tend to get off track and help them identify which internal and external resources are available to help them navigate their worlds, including the world of employment. So that, I think that's always been just a really important thing for me to remember, especially when thinking about resilience and self-efficacy for our clients. Another therapist says this: the purpose of psychotherapy is to bring about psychological change, not to blindly celebrate the patient's perspective, nor should we confirm that everything the individual thinks or wishes is literally true. Therapists and vocational counselors help clients bring about a psychological awareness, which allows them to help themselves. Affirmation alone will not provide this opportunity.
That's a good one. I like that one too. We mentioned Lisa Marciano a little earlier. She's a Jungian therapist and a social worker, and we found an essay by her called Collision with Reality that really nicely speaks to the issues that we're discussing here today. She shares our concern about the cultural moment, this trend that may be providing unwitting support for young people to claim oppression and illness. And you think that's ever helpful?
No, I don't think it would be at all. So, I mean, it's certainly, you know, knowing the illness is helpful. Having a diagnosis can be helpful in receiving treatment. But ultimately, she says that holding on to that as an identity can invite withdrawal and an avoidant coping style. As we stated earlier, that anxiety thrives in avoidance. And if you view yourself as oppressed or infirm, it can ultimately cultivate an external locus of control. So most of what happens, so then if that's the case, most of what happens to me is beyond my control and I have no effect to fix it or change it. And she states that, she also mentions kind of a cultural moment, but she focuses much more on those college campuses where, being a victim can raise your social standing. You've got, if you're a victim, then you've got others who come around you, and there's this language of allyship. And, again, being helpless or weak or completely identified by a diagnosis or the things that have happened to you, again, reinforce that external locus of control. And it moves the power away from the individual to build that resilience and self-efficacy.
Yeah, I'm thinking again of that either or disease where it could be helpful up to a point, but then taken to an extreme, it really seems counterproductive. She also talks about a troubling trend of young people on social media sites such as Tumblr and TikTok who are portraying themselves and getting likes and loves and so forth by portraying themselves as having various self-diagnosed mental health disorders such as dissociative identity disorder, post-traumatic stress, borderline personality, and Tourette's syndrome. Again, diagnoses can be helpful when they provide a context for our distress or normalize certain experiences and reduce stigma and point the way toward intervention and treatment. But emphasizing diagnosis as identity, as we said at the outset, risks fostering a sense of helplessness, which can actually in turn increase anxiety. So it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle.
In her article, she also references a New York Times article that kind of also talks about the increase of teen anxiety in the US and kind of creates more avoidant opportunities to accommodate. So school cultures that enable young people to avoid those things that make them uncomfortable. So leaving class early, using special entrances, seeking safe spaces when feeling overwhelmed. And one therapist who was interviewed for this particular article expressed concern that avoidance-based accommodations may actually worsen students' anxiety by fostering the impression that they're too fragile to handle those things that make them uncomfortable. And again, this points back to the idea that we don't want to go either extreme with either or. Accommodations can be helpful, but if we avoid those things that make us uncomfortable for too long, it can create this idea that they need to be avoided forever. It encourages those individuals to teach them that they're not capable of handling hard challenges, so that when those students grow up and come to my office and they have those common examples of, I can't drive because I'm too anxious, or I only want to work from home because I'm too anxious to interact with people. Avoidance accommodations could have, reinforced those beliefs about themselves. And the idea that it encourages them that the world ought to constantly meet their emotional needs every moment they have them. And what we know as VR counselors is we are preparing our customers for employment where they are going to be meeting all sorts of individuals that it will be impossible to accommodate as extensive as it seems some of these articles have pointed out have been happening.
And she wraps up along those lines, she wraps up by saying that creating a society in which we're encouraged to confront anxiety and face difficult realities matters, not just for the mental health of individuals, but also for our collective well-being, for the good of the society as a whole. Well, we've talked at some length about the problem, so we'd like to share a few suggested solutions, especially I know we've talked a lot about therapy, but bringing this more to what can we as VR counselors do to try to help. Well, one, we thought that we could help our customers be as successful as they can be by acknowledging, but without automatically affirming their current sense of marginalization, limitation, and however they're identifying themselves at that moment, by offering realistic encouragement, by pointing them toward resources and opportunities to challenge self-imposed limitations, keeping in mind that this will need to be individually tailored to meet the needs of the specific person. Some folks can handle bigger challenges at once. Some folks require more incremental, gradual challenges. One thing we might do is also coordinate efforts with our customers' therapists to try to brainstorm collaborative ways of building and promoting self-efficacy and resilience, promoting increased distress tolerance, and reinforcing recognition that growth almost always requires at least some acceptance of discomfort.
Again, and we also don't want to succumb to either or disease. I think it's really important for us as VR counselors to look at both the individual and the external things that are happening with them and kind of say, what can we take from your situation to help you build that resilience? And, prematurely affirming a person's identity may not ultimately serve them well, especially if that reinforces a self-imposed barrier or a type of avoidant coping. That is certainly something that we want to avoid because it could ultimately cause our customers harm. I think it's also really important that we encourage our customers to think about these following questions, especially if we're seeing them stuck in this place of anxiety or a disability or like a mental health piece being an immutable characteristic. So I would recommend that we advise our customers to ask, besides my diagnosis or my disability, who am I? What are my deepest needs? What do I value? What gives my life meaning? And where and how do I find purpose? And from there, those questions can begin a different conversation about that individual's strengths and capabilities and the priorities they have moving forward.
We also want to be participants in providing and encouraging opportunities for that kind of incremental growth that we alluded to. So incremental experiences of success. One way we VR counselors can promote that is by arranging for customers to have situational assessments or trial work experiences. Also, our Grand Rapids office offered a series of work readiness classes. In fact, we'll be starting those up again in a few weeks. And the intention here is to promote self-efficacy while also reducing the risk of flooding or overwhelming the customer. Finally, we thought taking a cue from substance abuse treatment, where there is with both substance abuse and eating disorders, there's always a risk of relapse, particularly if one is inadequately prepared for situations that leave them more vulnerable to reverting to old ways of coping. There's a lot to be said for the power and importance of written relapse prevention planning. So that, well, and here we're not just taking a cue from substance abuse treatment, we're also taking a cue from the Starbucks employee training manual, at least their old one, which was the recommendation to have a basic plan. So knowing that you're going to have to deal with some rude and obnoxious customers when you're working as a barista, for example, not that that's okay, but it's going to happen. So imagine those unpleasant situations, anticipate them, and come up with a written plan for how you're going to respond so that when you're in the situation, you know what to do. Well, I think that's about all we have for right now, but Emily, would you please check the chat for us to see if there are any questions?
Hi, everyone. Yes, we have one question. It's kind of a request and a question. For non-therapists or non-counselors on the call, or someone who's just not as familiar maybe with some of the technical language, I wondered if you could provide some kind of real world examples. And I think this was in reference to the self-efficacy techniques of how people can build that up.
Sure.
But I'm also wondering about maybe some real life examples of what you might hear someone say who's identifying with anxiety as their main thing, or maybe even like some solutions, like how would you treat someone who came in with anxiety who says, I can't drive, and that's that, what would you do?
Okay, well, there's a couple questions there, but let's see. The first one, as far as those sources of self-efficacy, one of the big ones is to have actual experiences of success. So a starting point there would be to look for very small ways in which the client or customer has had success and try to build on that. Or if the client or customer just can't identify one, then to start working, perhaps in collaboration with a therapist, on coming up with some ways to promote some actual experiences of success. I mentioned a couple of other sources of self-efficacy beliefs. And again, self-efficacy, you know, somebody once said a psychologist is somebody who uses, who says things everybody already knows using words nobody understands. And I think, you know, when we see a term like self-efficacy, our first thought is like, what the heck is that? Well, it's believing that you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. Okay, well then why didn't we just say that? So so let's try to simplify that. A couple of other sources of self-efficacy beliefs are: one, learning to obtain some voluntary control over your autonomic arousal. And anybody who struggles with or has struggled with anxiety knows two things. One, how difficult that can be in the moment, because an anxiety attack feels like it just happens. It feels like it comes out of nowhere, and I mean, that's why it's called an attack. But with adequate training and practice, many people can learn to use things like, say, breathing, exercise, meditation, self-talk, some of these things to actually not just create a belief that they're less anxious, but to actually obtain physiologically measurable results of reduced heart rate, reduced respiration, and so on. So to actually gain some control over that fight or flight reaction. What was the rest of the question?
I think that was pretty good. I was just putting in there like someone who says they can't drive, for instance,
Sure.
how to begin to break that down.
So I think because I was the one who keeps seeing these as common questions for my customers. A lot of the time it's having a conversation about, okay, well, what's behind that? Is it situational? Are there certain times of day you feel like you can't drive? Are there certain areas that you're not able to drive? Is it traffic? Is it highway? Like, let's kind of figure out, let's break it down. And then if it's just, nope, I can't drive, I'm too anxious, I can never do it. Then it really comes down to the reality of, okay, if you continue to not be able to drive, finding employment might be challenging if you don't have access to public transportation. And family and friends aren't always reliable. So knowing that reality and knowing those facts, how do you, client person sitting in front of me, want to handle the lack of being able to drive? Could there be a therapeutic piece that we could get you connected with? Are you willing to, maybe, if you have a driver's license, practice driving down the block or driving to the grocery store or coming to, we're not going to have you drive, 20 minutes a day every day, but let's build up that incremental piece to build that self-efficacy, to give you the experience. So those are kind of the conversations that I often have to get behind what they're saying, to say, you say you can't drive, but what are you saying about it, about not being able to drive? What are you actually saying? Those conversations I find happen a lot. So real life example, I had a client whose anxiety is still pretty pronounced, but I've worked with her for many months now, and she is so much further along with managing her anxiety. And when she first came to me, the statement was, I have anxiety, so you need to do XYZ for me. And had I affirmed that right away, we probably would have closed her case. But because I've challenged her and because I have set firm boundaries with her to say, you know what, these are the real life expectations and facts of an employment setting, no matter what you feel about how unfair those facts are, how do you want to work within these boundaries? And she has made tremendous strides, and we've affirmed them and congratulated them, and we've worked with her therapist. And so a lot of her anxiety is real, and it is something she biologically has, but a lot of it is so much self-imposed. And I've seen her just flourish because I've asked her challenging questions about her experience.
And I love what you just shared, because I think that illustrates a couple of the things we've been talking about. It certainly illustrates the either or disease part of thing, where you've got somebody who not only has a biological predisposition to anxiety, but then also has a psychological overlay with it. And maybe this is, I mean, from your description, this doesn't sound like somebody who's maybe ever going to be completely anxiety free, but what a remarkable transformation from what the person was experiencing when you first met her. Also, I think you're illustrating something we discussed earlier, or your narrative there illustrates something else we discussed earlier, which is that whole idea of using symptoms to meet needs, because clearly this person had some needs for support, encouragement, accommodation, and so on, but may have been attempting to meet those needs by ramping up the symptomatic behavior.
And truthfully, in her case in particular, when I've been working with her, I think she initially thought that I was being mean to her because I wasn't just affirming what she stated about her experience being absolute truth. And I got pushed back a lot, but I stood firm in, let's explore what's beyond what you're saying. And I think it really helped to be firm and to be a bit, to have me be perceived as combative. She perceived it that way. It wasn't true, but it actually helped her to grow.
Yeah, because you provided an actual experience of dealing with conflict
Mhm.
I mean, that's a piece of growth too, because we certainly all are, anybody dealing with a work environment is going to deal with conflict. So,
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Those are some great examples to help us understand. Appreciate that.
sure.
One additional question in relation to the teenage anxiety piece. Today's teens are also more aware of topics like impending effects of climate change, class inequality, online misinformation. These are external and global factors outside of their control. Do you think this plays a role?
Yes, because I think I think continually, whether or not those things are literally and factually true 100% of the time, continually being immersed in that online culture that is promoting all of those ideas can reinforce a sense of helplessness.
Mhm. So I think it's really important for anyone, teenager otherwise, to step away from the phone and to say, as human beings, I don't think we were meant to know all of that trauma and all of the struggles of the world all the time. We're not omnipotent. We can't fix it. So to always have access to that knowledge, I think is really hugely detrimental to our teenagers. And I would strongly encourage parents or counselors to tell their kids, put the phone down, step away from the internet, go outside. And you know what? You can only control yourself. You can't control the world. You can't control the violence that's happening. So go and try to be a decent human being. And understand that all of that can't be the focus, because it will ultimately harm.
And this, of course, doesn't mean be apathetic or be
Right.
unconcerned about suffering. It does, we're not saying that at all, but we are saying that I think there's a tendency by many people, not just young people, but by many of us, to mistake worrying for caring.
Yes.
And I could care deeply about someone, that's great, but just worrying about someone is not going to, someone or something is not going to help that other person or that other situation, but it is going to keep me very deeply disturbed and less functional. So again, going back to the either or thing, let's have a sense of proportion about some of these things. Or let's strive for a sense of proportion, and that can be part of our conversation with others about, well, yes, of course, there are nasty things happening in the world. How are you taking care of yourself even with those nasty things going on? Or what can you realistically do to help those things? Maybe we can't fix some terrible thing that's going on in another country or in a governmental agency or something, but we can be a little kinder and more sympathetic to our next door neighbor.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you. And that is all the questions that we have.
All right, well, I guess that's it then. So for anybody who was here, thank you. And if you have further questions, our contact information is in
There it
the
is.
slide. There it is. I knew it was in here somewhere. So there's our contact information. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.